Hello. Hello, Harry. How you doing?
Hey, how you doing, Melissa?
I'm good. Alrighty, everybody. We are live on Snakes for Everything. We're so happy to see everybody. There's a lot of comments and questions already, and I think we're going to hold off on those until the end of the presentation. I think will be the easiest thing. But yeah, I'm so excited to be with you here today, Harry, on Snakes for Everything. So for those who don't know me, I'm Melissa. I'm the executive director of Advocates for Snake Preservation. And we're a group, a nonprofit that is trying to change how people view and treat snakes. And I think probably most people turning in today already like snakes a little bit, or maybe they were intrigued by this particular title of Snakes Are Dangerous and are trying to get that confirmed or find out just how dangerous they are. We'll see. But I'm guessing that my guest today, Harry, needs no introduction, but just briefly, Harry is, gosh, I don't know, like the preeminent snake biologist, one of the preeminent snake biologists. You got your PhD after you spent some time as an Army medic, working with our board member, Gordon Burkhart, which is pretty exciting, and this small family of everybody knows each other in the snake world. You were a professor at UC Berkeley for a while, and then you were at Cornell, and now you've retired into Rancho Cascabel in Texas. Although, like most people I know that are retired, I think you're probably busier than ever, right?
Yep.
And you've written at least a couple books, and I think you're working on another one, maybe. Snakes, the Evolution of Mystery in Nature, which is, I think, a great example of like, it is academic, but totally readable for those who aren't academics and looking for science texts. And also just the photography in it is phenomenal. So it makes for a nice like coffee table book too, which is really cool. And if you really want to get to know Harry and learn about his various adventures throughout life, he also has something of a memoir called Tracks and Shadows, Field Biology as Art, which is a super, super fun read. And I just wanted to share a little bit, because you can read that bio like I did on a bunch of different websites anywhere. So how I first became acquainted with you, Harry, which I don't think you know, because I'm not sure I've ever told you this before, although you got a little hint yesterday. Way back in 1998, I went to my first herp meeting, the International Herpetological Symposium. It was in my home state of Kentucky. I think they were claiming that the location was Cincinnati, but the meeting was actually taking place in Kentucky.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, and I was working with birds at the time, and I had just met some reptile people, and so it was kind of starting to get the bug again, because I had always been interested in snakes, and they were like, there's this meeting, you should go, it'll be fun, you know, you can kind of see what's out there. And you gave a talk called something like Wild and Captive Snakes, Thoughts on Reciprocal Elimination. And that was where I first learned that rattlesnakes take care of their babies. And was just blown away by that. Even though I kept snakes my whole life, had no idea that was the thing that they could do. Because yeah, I mean, I think this was kind of the point of that talk too, from what little I remember, it was a long time ago, was that we don't give them, or at least at the time, we don't give them the chance in captivity to do all the cool things that they are capable of doing that they regularly do in the wild.
Yep.
And yeah, so I had no idea, and I think that really inspired me, man, a long time later to then study that very behavior, because I just was like determined until I finally saw it for myself in 2011 to see mommy rattlesnake with her babies taking care of them.
They're pups.
So yeah, that was pretty exciting. And that was actually where I first became acquainted. I mean, not like I didn't go up and talk to anybody because I was very shy, but Gordon Burghardt also gave a talk on kind of similar things on the private experiences of snakes, which Harry and I were chatting about a little bit before we went live. So I'll have to save that topic. Maybe we can get Gordon to talk about that on a future Snakes or Everything.
Yeah, that'd be excellent.
Yeah. But I think so I want to go ahead and get started with your talk. That I'm sure is what everyone actually came to see, not me yammering on.
So what should I do? Hit share screen?
Yeah, go to the screen share, and I'm going to stop my video.
How's that look?
That looks good.
And am I the only one that sees me up in the right-hand corner? I hope.
Yeah, I think everybody else should be able to see your slides, or see you off to the side of your slides.
Okay, so we're ready to get started.
Yep, go.
Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm Harry Greene, and I am really happy to be here with Melissa and to talk for just a little bit about kind of a wrinkle in this whole thing of appreciating snakes. I'm going to tell you about a bit of a personal journey in that regard. And the personal journey, I hope, will sort of, the loop will be closed within the next 30 minutes or so. Before I move from this title slide, let me point out a couple things. On the left, you see a Southern African python, maybe about 10 feet long, weighing maybe 15 to 20 pounds. And it's constricting a vervet monkey that weighs about half as much as a python does. Now, I'm going to bet that even a lot of people who like snakes and even have studied snakes, especially if they've only studied snakes in captivity, are wondering if that snake can actually eat that monkey. And I'm here to tell you that is not even a giant item for that snake. That food item is only about 50% of its mass. And we've got records now of boas and pythons consuming things well over 100% of their mass. So that's the first thing. And you'll be able to sort of reiterate this point as I go through some of my slides. Snakes are among the many kind of spectacular, fascinating, astonishing, beautiful things about them is that they can eat in a single meal, maybe 20%, 30% of their annual energy budget. The other slide on the right is somewhere between 11th to 17th century terracotta figure from the Niger Delta in Africa of a serpent devouring a human. And it's a fascinating thing to me that most of my life, I either read or heard that actually even the largest snakes can't swallow people because we have such big shoulder girdles. This claim, as far as I can tell, has always been made by a male Caucasian herpetologist. And the people that live in places where there are giant snakes typically are not as large as male Caucasian herpetologists. And in fact, we have a lot of evidence now that snakes have been devouring humans throughout our evolutionary history and even earlier. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. So yes, I'm going to talk about the fact that in addition to all these other wonderful things about snakes, they are dangerous. I'm going to sort of lay out the case for what I call a 75 million year long deadly dialogue between primates and us. And then I'm going to wind up at the end, talk about what I think the implications of owning up to this are for appreciating snakes and conserving snakes. Just a little bit more about myself. I spent most of my career being a natural historian and very happy about that. I got interested in reptiles as a 7-year-old on my grandpa's East Texas dirt farm. And I'm still out in the field watching snakes. One of the most spectacular field experiences of my life happened only a couple of years ago when, thanks to my friends Robin and Bryan Maritz, I accompanied them on studies of Cape cobras and the Kalahari Desert of South Africa. We had an amazing experience. You'll be reading more details about this within a year or two as we publish it, but we watched a Cape Cobra basically attend to a puff adder that it eventually ate over a 36-hour period, repeatedly visiting the puff adder, taking cover from the intense heat, coming back, visiting the puff adder again, envenoming it some more, checking on whether it was swallowable and so forth, and then finally eating it. The other thing to say while I've got this slide up is that I veered into anthropology and primatology over the last 20 years, especially the last 10 years. And that's led me to get more and more interested in sort of what really is our place in nature. What does wildness mean, and what does it mean to be part of a wild earth? So I won't be talking about that so much today, but I've been writing about it, thinking about it, and I welcome your interest in that. I'm going to lay out today what's basically called the snake detection theory. It was first laid out by Lynn Isbell in a wonderful book in 2009 called The Fruit, the Tree, and the Serpent, Why We See So Well. Especially this first part of my talk really comes straight out of Lynn's book, and I recommend the book highly to you. When we compare primates, which is the group of mammals to which we pertain, when we compare primates to other mammals, there are several features, several characteristics that are really impressive. And these are not just to other mammals more generally, but to our closest living relatives among mammals, which includes successively the so-called flying levers or colugos of Southeast Asia, the tree shrews of Southeast Asia, and then rabbits, their relatives, and rodents. So I've just listed the most closely related mammals to us. And when you compare primates as a group to those other mammals, we have more flexible shoulders, we have grasping hands and feet, we have relatively bigger brains. Of course, big brains evolve independently in some other groups, most notably the whales and their relatives. But we have what's called orbital convergence. So if you think about the way your eyes are facing compared to, say, most herbivores like a cow, our eyes are very much focused forward together. That gives us binocularity. That's called orbital convergence. We have lots of things that relate to sort of specialized vision, including vision control grasping. So it turns out if you watch a squirrel pick up a nut and bring that nut to its mouth, the squirrel's actually guiding its paws with chemical cues, with olfaction. When a primate like us picks up something and moves it to our mouth, we're using our eyes to guide our grasping forepaws. Primates have very snake-specific recognition mechanisms. These seem to characterize primates as a group, at least in a fairly rudimentary way. And as you move up into the evolutionary history of primates, from relatively simple primates like lemurs and so forth, through monkeys into the apes, and finally us, you see these snake-specific recognition mechanisms becoming more and more sophisticated. There's a sort of a diagram here of some of them, and the only thing I want to point out about this schematic, very simplified schematic of some neural network inside a monkey's face looking at a puff adder, is that some of these networks, some of these mechanisms are preconscious and some of them are conscious. And I must not be the only one, I'm sure I'm not, to have been out in the field, suddenly find themselves uncomfortably close to a large viper and make a movement that seems to be entirely devoid of sort of active cognition. It's not like I saw this bush next to my right foot, put it all together. Oh, it's got this color pattern, it's this big, must be Lachesis muta, blah, 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 and then acted on it. No. I acted without consciously working through what was going on, and only after the fact could kind of recognize what was going on. I think that's symptomatic of a preconscious recognition mechanism. I can say a little bit more later about whether any of this is innate or not, but I think the evidence for the current, at least at present, is it's not that so much we have innate fear of snakes, but that we have various innate recognition mechanisms. And I'll even show you one example in a minute of the kind of research that suggests that. Finally, I'll just reemphasize something I said just a minute ago. All these differences are enhanced in monkeys and apes, these differences between us and other mammals. So Primates are special. Within primates, monkeys and apes are even more special in terms of snakes, and within them, even more apes. And within the apes, we in particular have some very special relationships with snakes. I told you I'd show you one example. There are actually a lot of literature on this. Some of it's more neurobiological, involved in recording from specific neurons and specific integrated pathways that involve snake recognition. I'm just going to show you one here that's been used comparatively with both human children and with monkeys. Basically, if you give a human child a choice among a variety of different objects, including snakes, spiders, and mushrooms, what they have to do is, with a certain amount of exposure called challenging intention conditions, they have to pick out a type of object they've been cued to find. And so that's what this child is doing in the upper right figure. The child is looking at an array of things that include flowers, rocks, snakes, mushrooms, spiders, and so forth. Well, it turns out if you give either a child or a monkey a little more than a second to do this, they're equally good at picking out spiders, snakes, and mushrooms. If you make it more the task more challenging, and now you drop it down to 600 milliseconds, just over half a second, it turns out spiders and snakes are significantly, spiders and snakes become more special with regard to more general things like mushrooms. And then when you drop it down to only 300 milliseconds, less than a third of a second, it's very clear that we have a very special ability to pick out snakes, spiders perhaps, but no longer mushrooms. You give a child 300 milliseconds, it can't pick out a mushroom, it can't pick out a rock, but it can pick out a snake. Now, let's get into the snake detection theory just a little more. It basically has two parts. The two parts of the snake detection theory postulate, and I can spend some time on the evidence for this, that first of all, primates arose about 75 million years ago in the context of there already being present snakes that were capable of constricting and ingesting them. How did we know this? Well, in the upper right, you see what we can think of as a family tree for snakes. So all those words on the right are snake families. Those successively converging branches represent the divergence of those different families over about 100 million years of snake history. And the only thing I want you to remember from this is that if you look within that blue square, that inner blue square where you see things like the Pythonidae and the Boidae, those snakes are all constrictors. They all constrict in exactly the same way. And with a few derived exceptions, they're all capable of ingesting really big prey. Okay, so this is to say those abilities to constrict and ingest were present over 100 million years ago. What am I talking about, big prey? Well, here on the left is actually not a particularly large prey item for a snake. Again, I think that most people, especially if you've only watched captive snakes eat relatively tiny mice, you might be amazed at what snakes do in the wild. This is an adult Costa Rican boa constrictor, about 10 feet long, weighing a bit less than 25 pounds. I've seen the photographs of the snake after it ate that deer, and it's clearly a snake that's eaten something, but it doesn't look like the drawing in Little Prince where it goes and then gets this giant bulge and then back down to a skinny tail. After that boa eats that white-tailed deer fawn, it looks like it's a snake that's eating a modestly large prey item. Now, on the other hand, if you go to the lower right, this is the family tree for primates. And we're talking about a divergence, an origin and a divergence about 75 million years ago into two groups, the still relatively primitive lemurs and their relatives and everybody else. So this first kind of burst of specializations for recognizing and coping with snakes was present at the origin of primates. Let me just show you a little bit of natural history documenting these kinds of relationships. We've looked throughout the world at species that eat and are eaten by primates, species of snakes that are eaten and eaten by primates. And although there's no primate that specializes in eating, no snake that specializes in eating primates, on every continent, there's at least one species that often eats them. In Asia, it's the reticulated python. And here you see a list. These are just the primates and their close relatives that we have records of reticulated pythons eating them. The example you see here in the picture is a very dramatic one. This is a big female reticulated python that ate a long-tailed macaque and the infant that she was nursing. Here's another example from Madagascar. It turns out all the Madagascan boas eat primates, which is to say lemurs. Okay. Which is to say lemurs. And what you see here, first of all, is a list of the lemurs that are known to be eaten by Madagascan boas. I've got down here in the lower left a really fascinating example of this. This particular Madagascan ground boa lived for about a decade on the grounds of an eco-tourist resort in Madagascar. And it was seen many times by staff and visitors. This is a photograph of it one day eating a brown lemur that probably weighed about maybe a third of its own mass. This snake was known as Big George, although it was almost certainly a female based on its massive size. One day, Big George was lying in ambush next to a trail through some grass. Along came 7 cockerel shifakas. This is a very social big lemur. And Big George is lying in wait. Big George has an expectation for what size lemur it can successfully kill and swallow. A cockerel shifak definitely fits the bill. What Big George doesn't know how to anticipate is that primates are super social. They band together to defend one of their members against a threat. Big George strikes a pregnant female shifak, begins to constrict. All the other shifaks jump on Big George, begin biting her. The female shifak that's been grabbed manages to get free just enough to bite Big George in the head. Big George releases her. The lemurs all leave. The one who's been grasped gives birth to a normal infant. A few months later, Big George dies from wounds incurred during this skirmish. So it sort of shows you how complex all this can be. I mean, Big George can eat primates. Big George can't necessarily eat primates when they're in a social context. The second part of the snake detection theory is happens about 35 million to 50 million years ago, and that's with the origin of front fangs. And as I'll show you in just a minute, the problem there is mostly not being eaten by front fang snakes, but being defended against by front fang snakes because we scare them. So now in the primate tree of life, we're looking at this branching part in the blue rectangle, the part that leads to monkeys and especially great apes. Over here on the right, you see a gaboon viper in the field in Africa, super camouflaged. And it turns out there have actually been studies that showed that the big gaboon and the big gaboon vipers can actually are actually encountered and recognized by mangabey monkeys much more frequently than the herpetologists looking for them. So what do these front fangs do? Well, and just to back up slightly, if I've got anybody that doesn't know what I mean by front fangs, we're talking mostly about vipers and about the family, the Elapidae, that includes cobras, mambas, sea snakes, and their relatives. What do these big fangs, these front fangs do? We know that they serve to rapidly inject venom into a prey item. We know that depending on the snake and even the family, the toxins that are injected may emphasize tranquilizing, immobilizing the prey. They may emphasize tenderizing, digesting of the prey. They may play both functions, but clearly snake venoms, almost all snake venoms have major design aspects that have to do with the feeding biology of snakes. It's what allows them to subdue and eat things up to 150, even 160% of their own mass. However, front fangs do something else. And to explain that, let me just first set this up by saying, if you've ever been bitten by a big water snake, or actually more impressively by a boa or a python, you know that snake teeth are not designed for letting go. They're designed for hanging on. They're designed mainly for feeding, not for defense. And so if a snake bites something like me defensively, it's got a problem, because not uncommonly, it's kind of tangled up with me at least a few seconds while I defend myself. Well, if you look over here on the left, these are some high-speed video frames of a timber rattlesnake striking a live mouse. And just take it from me, we're seeing about 154 milliseconds. So less than 0.2 of a second between the time the tips of the fangs first contact the mouse and the time they're removed. What front fangs can do in a defensive context is let a front fang snake extremely rapidly deliver a punishing response to an adversary, okay? Now look up here in the right-hand corner. This is the tree of life of snakes again, but now I put a purple rectangle around just the groups that include the 3 times that front fangs have evolved within snakes, okay? They've evolved in vipers, they've evolved in cobras and their relatives, and they've evolved in a particular lineage of some really interesting African snakes called Lamprophiids and their relatives. So that happened, at least happened for the first time more than 35 million years ago. It's happened 3 times since then. And a fascinating correlate of all that is that only in this purple rectangle, including all the non-venomous snakes, only in that purple rectangle do we get the evolution of all these dramatic threat displays, hoods and cobras, rattles and rattlesnakes, saw scales and saw scale vipers, bright colors and coral snakes, many more specialized kinds of defensive signals. If we look at more primitive snakes like boas and pythons and so forth, we get camouflage, we get biting if they're confronted, sometimes we get loud hissing, but we almost never get any kind of specialized signaling, which is to say, you better not come closer to me because I'm going to make you really regret it in a way that's almost instantaneous, in which you cannot retaliate against me. That's what front fangs do for snakes in terms of defending them against adversaries. Well, it turns out about 20% of snakes have front fangs. So that's a minority of snakes are actually capable of backing up a signal that they're going to defend themselves instantaneously and painfully. But we think that as many as 50%, perhaps even more, of the rest of snakes, or at least crude mimics of the venomous ones, they're profiting, at least sometimes to some extent, from looking like venomous snakes, which is to say that the evolution of front fangs 3 times had a tremendous impact on the overall diversification of snakes. Here's a great example in this slide. On the right is a venomous cottonmouth, our only truly aquatic viper. Maybe you know there have been studies that show cottonmouths are especially unlikely to bite. It's really quite fascinating because they're famous for chasing people and so forth, none of which is true. They're famous for being very aggressive and tending to bite people. It turns out that's not true. The evidence actually suggests that cottonmouths might be among the least bitey pit vipers, at least of any in the United States. But they have this obvious signal that means don't get any closer. And I've actually personally had the experience of about to reach down for my day pack in Florida. A cottonmouth has crawled up and coiled next to it while I was away. And just as I put my hand down, I see this flash of white. Move my hand away, don't get bitten. Well, over here on the left is an eastern hognose snake and its defensive display. And I hope you agree with me that I'd be almost as likely to not put my hand next to that. Well, who are the actors in all this? Okay, we've always thought about birds and carnivores because they are visual, acoustic, and cognitive. But ever since I veered into anthropology and primatology, I'm thinking that primates might be actually, in many places, a real big player here. It is true that some front fang snakes eat primates. So on the left is a gaboon viper in equatorial Africa attempting to swallow a blue monkey. But I think much more frequently the result when primates and snakes meet each other is that snakes defend themselves and that sometimes at least the primates die. That's a potus monkey killed by a cobra on the right, and you see this quote here about a young baboon being killed by a Cape cobra. Well, anthropoids are not only visual, acoustic, and cognitive, they're super social, and they do something I call preemptively use weapons. And there are 2 important points there. Preemptively, in that not only humans, but non-human primates in all the major anthropoid lineages go out of their way to harass, hassle, attack, and sometimes kill snakes. And so when we do that, we're part of a very ancient biocultural tradition of using our ability to throw things, pick things up, use them as clubs and spears and so forth. Here's an example of, I mean, imagine if you're familiar with Terciopelos, this is a massive, giant venomous pit viper in Central America, and an adult male capuchin monkey using a stick as a club killed one. Here's another example of that super social preemptive weapon wielders. It turns out that within capuchin monkeys, just within capuchin monkeys, there's some divergence, and there are some savanna capuchin monkeys in Brazil called bearded capuchins, which not only use tools much more than the white-faced capuchins of Central America, but they have more complex interactions with snakes. It turns out bearded capuchins basically distinguish two kinds of snakes. One group are boas and front fang snakes and things that look like them. And the other group of snakes is everything else. And as you see on the left, when they encounter everything else, they check it out, they kill it, they eat it. You're looking at a male bearded capuchin here, get my cursor over there, has killed what looks like a vine snake, maybe Oxybulis. And this is a female with a young on her back, very carefully visually attending to what's going on. So this is how cultural traditions get built. You have communication among individuals, you have empathic learning and so forth, and this is a non-venomous snake. Over here, same locality, same species. These are two male bearded capuchins that have located a pit viper mimic in a crevice. They picked up a stick, thinned it out so it can make a crude thrusting lance, and they're going to poke at that animal and try to make it go away as much as possible. And finally, if we go to our closest living relatives, the chimps and bonobos, you may know that chimps and bonobos are mostly forest creatures. You may also know that there is a theory, sort of the savanna ape hypothesis of human origins, namely during drier periods in Africa, we diverged from the mainly forest-dwelling chimps and bonobo lineage, and we went off on our Lucy the Australopithecine destiny, became first bipedal and then big-brained, and so on and so forth over 7 million years of divergence from chimps and bonobos, and then a couple of million years of Homo. We are who we are today. Well, it turns out there's a savanna population of chimps. It's been studied by this woman, Dr. Jill Preach of Texas State University. She discovered incredible things, including that these savanna chimps make spears, which they kill. They skewer, kill, and remove from their hiding places little galago primates that they like to eat. Jill and her field workers have recorded about 10 times as many interactions with snakes in the savanna chimps as have been seen in all the studies of forest chimps anywhere in Africa. Clearly have a rich relationship with snakes. Here's a frame from a video on the right that Jill took of one of the male chimps overhand throwing a cannonball-sized rock at a python. And we're working right now together to go through all her records of snake-chimp interactions and sort of clarify exactly what goes on. Now, again, this is sort of part and parcel of what I view as a 75 million years long, sometimes deadly dialogue in which we have built up on millions of years of evolution and biocultural inheritance, a sort of tradition of both being very afraid of, easily recognizing, learning to be afraid of, and preemptively killing snakes. Just a couple of examples from modern humans still living indigenous lifestyles. It turns out when you use an immunological test to look at the blood samples from an Ecuadorian indigenous tribe called the Warani, 95% of the adult males had suffered at least one venomous snake bite. That's one front fang snake bite, and survived. About 50% of them had survived at least two venomous snake bites. Imagine what it would mean to our culture if among the people we know in Houston, Texas, or Phoenix, Arizona, 95% of the adult males had survived a venomous snake bite. Half of them had survived two or more. Another example shown on the right, this is a project that I worked on with anthropologist Tom Hedlund. Tom did his PhD work in the late 1960s with the Agta, a group of indigenous people who are relatively small in height and weight, and who had very intimate relationships with the giant snakes, the reticulated pythons. It turned out of 120 Agta he surveyed, 26% of the adult males had survived python attacks. So imagine you're a hunter-gatherer living in a rainforest scene, and 1/4 of you have already survived sudden, explosive predatory attacks by reticulated pythons. In fact, among the memories of these 120 people, there were 6 fatalities. And this is my last example for draw this to a close. There's a paper just published earlier this year in Science. It concerns a situation in which we believe humans have actually influenced snake evolution. So I have to set this up just a little bit. If you look at that image, that's a African spitting cobra in the instant of spraying venom at an adversary. It's an incredibly interesting adaptation that involves behavioral aspects such as specifically aiming for the eyes of an adversary. It involves modifications of the fang. It involves modifications of the toxins and the venom, so it specifically causes pain in eyes. And what we found out by looking at the evolutionary history of spitting cobras, so here you're looking at a tree of life, a family tree for just cobras and their near relatives. It turns out spitting has evolved 3 times, twice in Africa and once in Asia. And when we use molecular clock methods and fossil history to estimate the time that those spitting cobra lineages evolved, there's one of them, the top one here, that because there's no fossil record, we don't know how long ago in this branch the African ring-caul spitter evolved. But for these other 2 events, the African spitters and the Asian spitters, we have pretty good estimates of when they originated. And it turns out the African spitters evolved shortly after the divergence between the bonobo chimp lineage and our lineage going into a savanna environment, becoming more bipedal, being able to especially effectively use those preemptive weapons like clubs and spears and so forth. It turns out the Asian spitters are more recently evolved, and their origin corresponds quite nicely to the estimated time of arrival of Homo erectus, one of our extinct relatives, onto the Asian mainland. So what we're suggesting is that at least 2, and I suspect all 3 of the independent evolution of the only long distance defense in all of snakes had to do with our lineage, the hominins. So what do I think this has to tell us about appreciating and loving snakes in the 21st century? I think we're going to achieve coexistence with things that can potentially hurt us, whether it's scorpions or venomous snakes or lions or bears, whatever. I think we're going to achieve that coexistence by coming to terms with the risk, minimizing them as much as possible, and learning to love these other organisms for their many wonderful characteristics. Now on the right, this is a quote I've been using for about 30 years. It's from a Senegalese conservationist who at a 1978 meeting of the IUCN said, "We will conserve what we love what we understand, and understand what we're taught." And I really like this quote because it sort of ties it all together. It says, we're going to go out and learn about snakes like Melissa does, and like I do, like Emily Taylor does, like so many other people do now. We're going to take what we learn, we're going to teach others, and that understanding is going to lead to love, and we're going to coexist with these organisms. I now think that a sort of fuller explanation, a fuller presentation of this truth is as follows. We're going to conserve what we love because we've learned it's wonderful and we've made it so it's not too risky. We're going to love what we understand and no longer fear. And we're going to understand what we are taught to care about and appreciate safely. So that's my message for today. I really enjoyed meeting you all, at least distantly like this, and I look forward to answering questions.
Yay!
Huh.
That was awesome, Harry. I have seen parts of that before, but not the whole thing. Certainly not with the spitting cobra new science. So that was really exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah, man, to think that pretty much all the pictures you showed of snakes eating things were not examples of like really large things, making me question how I'm feeding our little teacher snakes that we keep.
Well, just a little sidebar on that. You know, one tricky thing is that you can't put a black-tailed rattlesnake in even a spacious cage by current captive standards and throw a rabbit in there and expect it to eat it. So, you know, whether the snake is willing to eat something is not just a matter of whether its gape will permit it, but it's got to be psychologically secure in doing that. And as you know from watching rattlesnakes a lot and other snakes in the field, you know, most of what they do is very clandestine. I mean, I would say that's almost a big deal about being a snake is not having to deal with predators, you know, sort of making everything as safe as possible before you finally do it. So that's a tricky thing about making it happen in captivity.
Yeah, that is a good point. Yeah, for real. All right, so I've got some questions that I've been collecting, and most of these were submitted ahead of time. So feel free to stick questions in the chat for those who are watching us live. If you have some additional ones, and hopefully we'll have time to get to all of them. I don't want to keep Harry any longer than noon, because that is what we kind of talked about for this. So these are not necessarily all related to the topic of your talk. So if you don't feel, I mean, you're qualified to answer any of them, but, we can always come back with answers if you need to. So first one is.
And if I could just interrupt, Melissa, excuse me. I've given you my email address. I'm happy to, I mean, if I get 1,000 emails, it'll take me a while to answer them, but I'm strongly committed to snake education in as many ways as I can. So yeah, sorry I interrupted you, Melissa. Thanks.
Oh yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, and I will, because this is going to stay up on our YouTube channel, and I'll also go up on Facebook and Instagram, and I keep an eye on all those for new questions, and I'll email those to you.
Okay, great.
So if more of them come in. So
Thanks.
First question I have is, how are snakes different from legless lizards?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe it's a very strange pattern, but limblessness has evolved over 100 times just among lizards. One of those evolutionary events of limblessness was snakes, but they're literally over 100 other times, many of them just in skinks, for example, where a kind of reptile with sort of a normal lizard shape, think fence lizard or something, just gets longer and longer and longer. As it becomes longer and more attenuate, it gets smaller and smaller limbs. And a long time ago, a guy named Carl Gans pointed out there's a big problem with that, because as you get longer and skinnier, your mouth gets smaller. So imagine taking a fence lizard shaped reptile, keep that mass, let's say it's 100 grams, or you can call it 5 pounds or whatever, and now make it long and skinny. We've still got 100 grams or 5 pounds or whatever of tissue to support, but now we have a tiny mouth. And it turns out among these more than 100 evolutionary independent origins of limblessness, that problem has been solved 3 different ways. One of them is like blind snakes and some other limbless lizards. You just eat a lot of tiny things. And if you do that, it helps if they're a social thing, so they're clumped and you don't have to search for each one individually. That's what blind snakes do. A second way is to actually bite chunks out of a big object. And that's what caecilians do, these strange limbless amphibians. And that's what these amphisbaenians, which are these crazy annulated, granulated, big skulled things that live in the tropics and in Florida. They have really tough, big, sturdy skulls with giant teeth, and they just grab onto something and pull a piece off, swallow it, and go back for some more. And what snakes did, most snakes, is to basically redesign their whole head so that they can walk their jaws around a huge object and only have to eat a few times a year. That's what's really special about snakes, is most snakes, is to be able to eat such big objects.
Very cool. I had no idea 100 times. That's amazing. I knew that there were multiple occurrences, but yeah, I mean, I think as humans that rely so much on our hands, and seeing something without any hands or feet seems like a huge handicap. And but they've, I mean, just looking at their success and the number of species should be of just snakes are an indication. But yeah, I mean, obviously it just works for a lot of other animals too. Pretty cool.
Yep.
All right. So actually, this isn't really a question, but it's a comment someone wanted to write into you. So I'll go ahead. I think this was from Robert Villa, who's the president of the New Zealand Herpetological Society.
Hi, Robert.
I became a fan of Pablo Neruda because of your book on snakes. Recently, I read his Ode to the Storms of San Cordoba, in which he described the snake as slithers like slow lightning across the ground. In the same sentiment, certain indigenous cultures associate rattlesnakes with lightning, both striking and burning. That's pretty cool.
That's very cool.
That is very cool.
Yep.
Next question. One of the greatest lessons I've learned from you is listening to people's anecdotes about snakes and turning them into real research questions. Have you heard any good ones recently that have piqued new research ideas?
Ah, well, Melissa and I were just talking before we got started about what Gordon Burkhardt calls the private experiences of uh, of reptiles in general. And I'm going to turn the compliment back on Melissa. I think that the things that we're learning now, and Melissa's a major player in this, the things we're learning now about the complexity of snake social behavior, it's just, I mean, when I was a graduate student, we weren't prepared. We were not prepared to think about snakes like this. I mean, we now have multiple observations. I mean, think of Rulon Clark and his students' videos of rattlesnakes constructing their ambush tunnels by moving vegetation out of the way. I mean, that's mind blowing, you know. And then you get Melissa with all her moms parking their pups with another mom and then going and doing something else for a while. I mean, this isn't made up. If you told me this when I was an undergraduate, I would have thought it was just science fiction. It was inconceivable, you know. And we look back on people like Klauber, who wrote the giant rattlesnake book. You know, he kind of literally ridiculed the idea that there was parental care in rattlesnakes. He was doing that in the mindset of his time, you know. So I'll give him a sort of a certain break, but we've all had those blinders. And so to me, the frontier is to start thinking about snakes and reptiles more generally as having complex inner lives, and that those complex inner lives actually are part of what's going on. You know, they're not just solving some simple problem. They're integrating what's my current problem. I'm a patch-nosed snake and this whiptail lizard mama keeps grabbing my tail. You know, the patch-nosed snake's going to put all that in a context of everything that's happened to it before. And I think that's an incredible frontier.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously couldn't agree more with that because I love taking those. And I think I hadn't heard that from you before, you know, this specific thing about turning anecdotes into research questions, but I forget who, Mark Bekoff, maybe somewhere else I remember seeing it's like an anecdote is just, it's a single data point. It's just about going out and collecting more.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty cool. So see, this is a good question. We get this one a lot, or as a statement of fact. So it'll be interesting to hear your take on it. Are urban interface rattlesnakes rattling less often due to unnatural selection by humans?
Yeah, you know, I don't have the reference right at hand, but I'm pretty sure this idea goes back to Edward Cope, at least in the late 19th century. It's not a recent idea. It's an extremely widespread belief now. It's quite common in Texas. It's been converted into various little versions, like it's the wild pigs that are doing it, it's the people that are doing it, and so forth. I don't know of any systematic evidence to support this possibility. I'm not arguing actually that it's impossible, but it's complicated because it could be not selection at all. It could be the experiences of individual snakes. When I taught at Berkeley, there are still rattlesnakes on the Berkeley campus, and the campus rattlesnakes at Berkeley are among the most mellow I've experienced anywhere in my life. And, you know, we can joke about that. It's Berkeley, right? You know, maybe they're rattlers on weed or something, but they are mellow. They are super mellow. I had one that I caught in a childcare center on campus for 19 years, and it only rattled once, and that was the day of the Loma Prieta earthquake. And yet you could go out to Corral Hollow, maybe 25 airline miles away, and the rattlesnakes are rattling as you get out of your car on the road to pick them up. And it also seemed the gopher snakes were in parallel a lot more quick to be defensive out at Corral Hollow than they were on the Berkeley campus. The question is, though, I mean, this could be selection. You could have microevolution going on, but you could also have individual rattlesnakes on the Berkeley campus simply growing up without ever being threatened, without ever having the experience of being pushed past the threshold to rattle. And with each encounter where they're not pushed past the threshold to rattle, suffer no bad consequences, they habituate more and more to people. And as grown adults, maybe 20, 25 years old, you know, a person walks by, it's just no big deal to them. whereas the one out at Corral Hollow barely escaped a badger when it was only 2 years old and has been fighting for its life ever since. So it's a hugely interesting question, but I don't think the evidence is out there to say for sure one way or another.
Yeah, that calm rattlesnakes in a place where they haven't seemed to have suffered persecution. That was something that Jeff and I noticed when we worked at the Nature Conservancy Preserve, and on a super micro scale, like right around the housing, snakes that we would encounter almost every day in the summer. Like, yeah, I mean, you could just walk right next to them. Sometimes I feel like you could step on them and they would never rattle. They also seem to figure out to not sit in places where people step. And then we would also figure out not to walk where they sit. But
cool.
You walk a half mile downstream and all of a sudden you start entering the territory of snakes that, hadn't had that many encounters with, and it almost seemed like they would rattle more like the further away you got. And it was something that if we had stayed there, that we had talked about trying to figure out how to study that, because it was the opposite of this phenomenon that's often described. So it's it's interesting.
And Melissa, if I could just add, I think what you've just described, what we're talking about right here, and what that question addresses is coexistence. I mean, we're going to coexist with dangerous animals when we, I think, kind of collectively, both species work out sort of the rules of how we can all be in this place in a way that minimizes risk to both of us, that we're both willing to accept. To me, that's kind of a conceptual picture of coexistence in the future with dangerous animals. And snakes, if we can work it out with snakes, bears ought to be easy.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
All right, so I don't know, maybe this was covered in the talk. I don't know that you boiled it down this way, but what's the least dangerous and most dangerous snake in your opinion?
In the world?
I guess.
Oh,
they didn't specify.
This is one of those questions herpetologists get a lot, and is frequently and annoyingly the case. Scientists tend to not give you a simple answer. So, by most dangerous, do you mean the one that kills the most people, or the one that could most likely kill you if you did get bit? Those usually would have very different answers. So just to take the United States, I mean, an untreated snake bite with full envenoming from a coral snake is almost certain to kill you. And a grown, healthy adult often would survive a snake bite from a fairly large rattlesnake. It wouldn't be fun, and you might be permanently crippled, and you might die. But you see those differences. Well, in fact, coral snakes, they almost never kill anybody, okay? Because they almost never bite anybody, You have to pick one up to get hurt by a coral snake. Whereas even among the rattlesnakes, I just read an incredibly interesting paper looking at snake bite by Massasaugas in the northeastern US over the last 2 years, the last 150, 200 years. And it turns out Massasaugas, which are not big rattlesnakes, they were regularly killing people until the advent of antivenom in 1930. And that's not a big rattlesnake. So, but if you ask, well, who's killing the most people in the US? I imagine Western Diamondbacks are among the top causers of the very few deaths in the US every year from snake bite. You go to other countries, the answers are going to be different.
Yeah, there's so many snakes all over the world, and throwing in the, how often do people come into contact with them? How likely are you to get bit? Yeah, it's just, it is an annoying habit that we have, because I do that every time somebody asks me what's the deadliest snake on earth. It's like, to who? To where?
Yep.
But yeah, I think it's interesting to put it in that. Okay, we're getting close to 12. So all right. Do you know which constellations are named after snakes?
Oh, this is so embarrassing. I think I'm literally dyslexic about astronomy. So, I watch other people look up the sky and just start rattling off, no matter what time of year it is. You could just take these people outside at night and they start telling you the names of all these things. I just haven't been able to do it. And so I'm just terribly ignorant of the answer to that question. Maybe Melissa knows.
I don't, and I should, because there's an astronomy column in our local paper, and last month it talked about a snake constellation, and I was like, oh, that's cool, but the
Yeah.
name has left me. If
Yeah.
anyone knows and wants to put the answer in the chat,
Yeah.
that would be cool. But yeah, sorry. Yeah, so let's see, next question. So these are questions that came in during the talk. So thinking about the human fear of snakes, and this came up when you were talking about that study with the monkeys and the young children, and being able to identify snakes faster than spiders and mushrooms. So perhaps we're born to it, but can it be unlearnable? Or maybe that's too much of a leap. Perhaps we're being primed to see them equals or does not equal being primed to fear them.
Yeah, that last part is certainly at least part of the answer. It's clear there are different parts of the brain that deal with recognition and with fear, and then connections get made or are present between those different neurobiological systems in the brain. And people used to talk very authoritatively that we had this innate fear of snakes, but it turns out to actually show that an organism innately fears something, you have to know in detail the individual history of that organism. And it turned out in a fair number of these studies where a zoo monkey would, they'd bring up a snake, the monkey'd freak out. And we don't know how many other times, we don't know the prior history of that individual monkey with people showing it snakes, with people maybe torturing it while showing it snake. We don't know anything about that. And to actually ascribe some kind of genetic innate fear, you have to know those things. I don't think the evidence is there, not yet at least, for a truly innate fear of snakes. But it is clear, boy, can we recognize them fast. We really attend to snakes. I didn't go into the details. In primates, there are actually recognition patterns that pick out very quickly an elongate object with cross patterning with it. I mean, that's amazing. That's a snake. And there are field studies using exposure, of wild vervet monkeys to models and snakeskins and stuff. It's clear that primates as a group, and especially anthropoids, we are tuned into snakes. Now I could show you pictures of just fascinating pictures of like a bunch of young savanna baboons attending to an adult black mamba, not running from it, attending to it, leaning over, peering at it from a safe distance away. We're talking about one of the most dangerous snakes in the world, and these little savanna baboons are going over to see what it is. So yes, we definitely have these tendencies, these recognition mechanisms and so forth, and then those all plug into what we're taught, what we see other individuals do, and so forth. It's a complex problem and a fascinating problem.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to imagine that we'd ever have that answer for humans, because just ethically trying to do a study with totally naive baby humans is
Yep.
probably not
Yep.
something. But yeah, okay, well, that's good to hear, because I know you've looked into this more than I have, and my answer when people ask me about that is just, yeah, we have an innate draw to them. And since I've learned from you about this history with primates and the vision stuff, it's just we can see them, but whether that's fear or just kind of curiosity or fascination seems to be learned based on what we know now.
I will add, there's some fascinating problems within this. So I've read, for example, that it is easier to induce a fear of snakes than a fear of firearms, and harder to extinguish a phobia of snakes than a phobia about firearms. And that's completely irrational in our culture, right? You and I should be a lot more worried about firearms as a general issue than we are about snakes. If we lived in Senegal, that wouldn't be true, or at least in rural Senegal,
Yeah.
So it's very complicated. And whatever the answer, there's clearly variation among people. How did it come to pass that you and I are not phobic about snakes at all? In fact, we're drawn to them. I'm phobic of spiders, big time, go figure.
I'm getting better about my spiders. I'm still having trouble with the giant centipedes, especially now that I live someplace. Actually, since now that I live someplace where they regularly come into the house and I find them under trash in our yard, I'm getting a little better. They're a little less scary, and also I know that they're at least partially responsible for drawing in the rock rattlesnakes into our yard that I love.
That's right.
So, So before I go to the next question, there were a couple of people that did chime in about the constellations. So Hydra is a water snake and Serpens is a snake. I mean, yeah, so that is the snake constellation is Serpens. That's probably why I didn't like write it down, because I'm like, I'll remember that. That's obvious. So that's cool. And there's also one called Draco, between the Little and Big Dipper. So yeah, snake or maybe lizard dragon. I know with a lot of like mythological creatures, oftentimes dragons are basically snakes with like lizard jaws. Yeah, so very cool. So and Gordon is chiming in on this the sphere thing.
Oh, good.
Hi, Gordon. Our work on Japanese snakes controlled for many factors, and some are very innately fearful and live in an area with virtually no dangerous snakes. That is amazing. Yeah, Gordon, you have to come on here and talk about this sometime.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Gordon.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. All right, let's see. So, and if you need to go, Harry, because now it's after 12, that's fine. There's a few more questions, or we can keep going, whatever you need to do.
Let's take a couple more. I got a lunch engagement before too long, but let's take a couple more. How's that?
Okay, so it looks like you actually covered this in the presentation, the evidence of primates eating snakes. It looked like that was part of that paper. So so yeah, he flashed that up, and Allison, I'll get the citation for that and put it in the comments for this video later. She was the one who asked that question. Let's see.
Happy to send a PDF of that. For example, I mean, if anybody wants to read the spitting cobra paper or the Agta Filipinos getting eaten by the python paper, just shoot me an email and ask, and I'll send you PDFs.
Yeah, cool. Let's see. So I do not have many snakes, and certainly no venomous ones where I live, but how often do you see snakes in the wild in America, and where are they often found? Like under logs? Everywhere?
Yeah, it varies so much. One kind of interesting comparison is between temperate and tropical regions. So as with almost all organisms, when you go from temperate zone to tropical zones, the number of species shoots way up. So there could be 60 species of snakes in a square mile of rainforest in Costa Rica. And I mean, 60 species of snakes, think about that, you know. But on the other hand, if you were in Costa Rica, I worked there a lot, and I used to average one snake a day walking 5, 10, 12 miles. Whereas there are places in Texas and Kansas and Western Missouri where you could go out on a prairie hillside in April and easily find 100 ringneck snakes in a couple hours. So I've just talked about two different things, abundance and number of species, and it just varies a lot. I mean, Melissa, some places are snaky and some places aren't.
Yeah, and in addition to, you know, number of species and how easy they are to find just because they're there, and like, yeah, relative abundance with some of those snakes occurring in really thick numbers, season too, and like climatic conditions, you know, I mean, how last summer, you know, in our yard, since we've moved there, you know, when we've had really dry summers, we hardly see any snakes, and you know, in wet summers, we tend to see more so far. But even that doesn't mean that on any given day, I'll go out and see anybody. There's so many factors, and it's hard for me when people ask questions about snakes in general to do anything but that scientists like, well, it's complicated, because they're a very diverse group. They live in a lot of different places and in a lot of different conditions, you know, except like I can say, you know, if you don't want snakes in your yard, move to Alaska. You're guaranteed. Okay.
That's right.
All right. So I think this is the last question. Interacting with, interacting with the non-venomous snakes there, it seemed obvious to us that the youngest children were not at all afraid of snakes, but the adults were. And the older the group, the more of them would be afraid. Do you have any additional insights from your research on the ontogeny of snake fear in primates? Is this evidence that the fear is mostly learned in humans, which we kind of already talked about a little bit?
Yeah, and I think Gordon's comments made it clear that this is actually a very exciting area of ongoing research, and And I don't actually feel competent to answer that question in a way that I don't want to imply that I have the right answer to that question. So I'd say really cool question, really exciting, and stay tuned.
Yeah, we'll see if I think that's a nice place to leave it. And I think that there's definitely interest out there to get we could get a whole talk on that topic, because it's, yeah, and it obviously plays a very important role in thinking about how we coexist with snakes, which is what Ask is all about.
Yep.
So yeah, so thank you everyone for tuning in today. I apologize that there was, especially in the beginning, a lot of background noise whenever my microphone's on. We live out in the woods, like way out in the woods, and that's where our office is. So I'm at a coffee shop, and I can't just tell everyone to be quiet, because I'm just, grateful that the Tranquil Buzz allows me to do this in their spot and take up a seat for an hour and a half. So yeah, thanks everyone for sticking with us through that. And thank you so much, Harry, for joining us today. I think I speak for everyone when I say this was great and I learned a lot. And yeah, thank you all for coming. And continue, if you're watching this later, put your questions in the comments and I'll make sure that Harry gets them and gets you answers back. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks,
and
Melissa.
have a great World Snake Day.
Take care.
Bye.